Hello, I'm Robert, a voluntary fact checker and helping you if you're scared of many things. And this is the second half of this blog post I'm going to talk about. So if you look at the name of it, why Trump can't stop the Iran war at any time, I've talked about it in the first half. And the second half, I talk about why there was never any way for it to be a world war, and a conflict confined to a region of the Middle East is not a world war, no matter how many soldiers there are there from how many different nations. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. I've talked separately quite a lot of times about how we can't have a nuclear war, so I'm not going to cover that topic here because it would take me too far afield to repeat everything again. So why there's no possibility of a world war, and never has been. So Iran can't fight a world war, and even Russia and China can't, and they're not going to join in. So we need to understand what is meant by a world war, and what is meant by a world war that is not a world war. So in a world war, you have two either superpowers or groups of countries that are in a single war, that they're fighting with each other, that is happening all over the world at once, in many different places all across the world, or different parts of the world. Not everywhere, of course, but widely separated and on different continents. It's all happening at once. And it's over those two groups fighting each other. And it is not a situation where there are several different wars happening at the same time in different parts of the world. That is not a world war. That is, and we've often been in that situation where for different reasons there's a war happening in Asia, there's a war happening in Africa, and there's a war happening in Europe or something all at the same time. That is not a world war, if they're about completely different things and different countries involved. And so that's the sense in which there's no possibility of a world war. So at the moment, we've got a war happening in Ukraine, and we've got a war happening in in the Middle East. We've got several small wars happening almost all the time in Africa, and that's not a world war because they're not connected with each other. So, and Iran can't fight a world war, and even Russia and China can't. And so the world war is also not defined by where the soldiers come from. So in the Iran war, the soldiers come from the United States, so it's from the continent of America, and from Israel, and they're fighting the Iranians, which are from the Middle East. So you could say, well, that's a world war because we've got soldiers from the United States fighting in the Middle East. It's not. It doesn't matter where the soldiers come from. What matters is where the fighting is happening. And the fighting is happening in the Middle East. So it's not a world war. And there's a very clear example of that, which is the Gulf War. So that was confined to tiny Kuwait, mostly, and to a certain extent in the neighbouring Iraq. And this involved countries, from several dozen countries, I think it was 44 countries or something like that, from every continent on the planet, apart from Antarctica, because there isn't any military in Antarctica. Almost every other continent, then there were soldiers that they sent to fight in Iraq, to fight against the Iraqis in Kuwait. In places like Australia and America and United Kingdom, France, they were all fighting in tiny Iraq, in tiny Kuwait. And it was not only that, it was the largest number of soldiers the United Kingdom has sent to any war since then. Same for the United States, the largest number of soldiers they've sent to fight in any war. And so this involved lots of soldiers from lots of countries, all fighting in a very small area. That's not a world war because it all happened in Kuwait. Remember, it's the area of the conflict that defines whether it's a world war, not the number of countries that soldiers come from. So Iran is not a world war because the conflict is all happening in Iran. And even if China and Russia did join in, if all the fighting happened in Iran and the Persian Gulf, it would still not be a world war. We actually have situations like that from the past. So I think the most striking example is the Korean War, where the United States were fighting with their best fighter jets, and then the Soviet Union was fighting with their best fighter jets, which were actually superior to the United States fighter jets at that time. But the Soviet Union were disguised as Korean soldiers, aviators, but they were actually Russian. And it was an open secret because they spoke Russian and they looked European, and it was obvious to the Americans that these were actually Russians and they weren't Koreans. But they had this disguise. They wore Korean uniform and they had their ships, their aircraft with Korean camouflage and markings on them, and the Red Star of North Korea. So that again, it was the Soviet Union directly fighting the United States in Korea, but the fighting was confined to Korea, so it wasn't a world war. And we've had several occasions since then when the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War, they shot down each other's planes in different places, and this immediately de-escalated. That wasn't a world war just because they're fighting each other, just because they shot down a plane. Immediately de-escalated, didn't lead to anything. That's not a world war either. And countries do immediately de-escalate. So now if we go and look at the Middle East, Russia and China, they actually were in an operation, anti-piracy operation, in the Persian Gulf before the United States did their strike. The United States waited until they'd left the Persian Gulf. Russian and Chinese ships had left the Persian Gulf before starting the war. One of the earliest acts in the war was for the Americans to sink many of the Iranian warships that had been in this very exercise with the Americans, with the Russians and the Chinese. So the Russian and Chinese, did they go sailing back to try and save their Iranian comrades? No. They just kept on sailing away. There was nothing they could do, even if they wanted to, and they're not actually allies, so it's very misleading to think of Iran as being an ally with anyone. They don't share military secrets, they probably some intelligence sharing. It's a sharing of technology by the way of selling for commercial reasons. And very limited actually shared objectives either. They're not allies, there's no defence agreement. And Russia and China, even if they were obligated, they couldn't have done anything. Because all they had, so you get this very misleading claim on the news that Russia and China have blue navies, which means a navy that can actually fight overseas. They do not. Not against France, the United States, or United Kingdom. Russia could never fight those overseas. The reason is that Russia and China don't have aircraft carriers. So the Soviet Union used to have aircraft carriers, but they were all, a couple ended up in museums for tourists to look at in China. One was scrapped, one was sold to the Indian. India is now using it as its aircraft carrier. One is just not fit for use anymore and probably going to be scrapped, no longer serviceable. And that's the end of the Soviet Union aircraft carriers. And Russia, as a result, doesn't have any way to take planes to fly its fighter jets outside of within reach of the bases in Russia, because they don't have a mobile airport to take them to anywhere else. And Russia and China, they both have strategic bombers that can fly very long distance, thousands of kilometers, but they aren't stealth. The United States is the only nation that has stealth bombers, the B-2 Spirit, that can't be seen in radar very easily at all. China and Russia have never developed that capability. So they're bombers that can actually fly very long distances are very easy for the United States to shoot down. And then when it comes to so all that they can actually send to the Persian Gulf, even Russia, which is quite not that far from the Persian Gulf, all it can send there are helicopters on their warships. So these warships that were doing these anti-piracy exercises with Iran, all they had were helicopters, which are useful against pirates, but they're useless against fighter jets, because, as you probably know, helicopters there aren't any stealth helicopters. Nobody's managed to actually build one. So helicopters are very obvious on radar, and they are also slow, and they'd be just very vulnerable to if they're not protected by fighter jets. And then the warships, they're very vulnerable if they're not protected by fighter jets too. And they've got air defences, but then there's not much use really if that's all you've got and you haven't got any air power. So the Chinese and the Russians, they just had to keep sailing away. Even if they wanted to help Iran, there's nothing they could do. So Russia and China, the Soviet Union was capable of fighting a world war. It could project power over the seas with the technology of the time and what was expected of capabilities at that time, and because of its aircraft carriers. But the modern Russia does not have that capability anymore. It's lost that capability. China has aircraft carriers, but they can only travel as far away from China as the Philippines. So they don't have that capability either. None of them have any bases in anywhere near the Middle East. Russia is the closest, but it's the other side of Iran from the Persian Gulf. So there's not really much that they can do, and quite a bit north of Iran. And they no longer have bases in Syria, which still would be quite a long way away as well, very long way away from the Persian Gulf. So they don't have any air power. Without air power, you can't protect your ships. Without air power and without a navy, then you can't really fight. So that's why Russia and China, they couldn't join in even if they wanted to. And then the other thing is, during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union, they shot down each other's planes, and then it immediately de-escalated every time. So when people say, and there's a claim that they're not actually at World War, but they're just on the point of it, that's not true at all. There's nothing even remotely, in any way, anything like a World War going on. Not even a few miles away, not even 1,000 miles away from, or metaphorically, not even 1,000 miles away from World War. There's nothing here that is even remotely resembling anything like a World War. And we had the Gulf War as I was talking about, in the 1980s, and that was a far more intense war than this, involving, as I said, countries from all over the world. And we didn't have these people, these pundits and these journalists saying, look, we're about to have a world war, because it obviously wasn't. And so the only thing new today is clickbait journalism and people making things up. And I was asked to debunk a video just now by someone, and it was someone just making a whole series of lies. I scored 0 out of 10 for factual accuracy in this video. Of all the things they said, everything they said was false. I have 10 statements. So you get people who just make things up in order to try to get attention. And so there's no way that China or Russia are going to get involved in this. It's localized to Iran. It could never get any further. Nearly all the destruction is happening in Iran, with bombs dropped by the United States and Israel. Iran is managing to shoot some ballistic missiles and the Shahed drones out, which do not have they don't have the explosive capabilities of the bombs that the United States and Israel are dropping on Iran. and they're being shot down because the United States and its allies have very impressive, very good capabilities for shooting down ballistic missiles, and they're just about to getting help from Ukraine to shoot down the Shahed drones, which they can also shoot down, but they're using very, very expensive interceptors costing $1 million or more to shoot down very inexpensive drones. So that was the main issue there. They had plenty of the interceptors as long as they didn't go for too long, but and now they're substituting them with Ukrainian drones. So Iran is just not able to do much destruction even in the area of the Arab states. They're even almost within artillery range, the other side of the sea, and there's very little that Iran can do. So the idea that Iran is somehow going to start attacking the United States just doesn't make sense. The only way they could do that is by smuggling drones into a ship. So that there's this intelligence that got shared that there was a claim that the Iranians were going to fly some Shahed drones from off the seas of California to attack California, and it wasn't seen as credible by the intelligence at the time, and it never happened. And this was before the Iran war started. The claim was that they would do this as soon as the war started, which obviously didn't happen. But the Iranians, they're very practical in terms of they do terrorist attacks, but they're for a reason, and that would not be something that would help Iran anyway. So they'd have been shot down by the United States fighter jets. They could never get close to the shore because you have shore inspections and so on. It was quite an improbable story. So it's this is very confined to the Middle East area. And then we just want to talk briefly about the situation with Russia. Russia it's never going to attack NATO. So yes, I've got 70 minutes. Perhaps I'll talk to the second half of this. No, it won't take that long. Less than half an hour, I think. So there's no way that Russia is really going to attack NATO. So you need to understand that Ukraine it's very similar to East Germany. It was the defense hub of the Soviet Union for making aircraft carriers. So those Soviet Union aircraft carriers I talked about, they were all made by Ukraine. Also for making ICBMs. So not all the ICBMs, but a significant number of the ICBMs that Russia has were made by Ukraine. And Ukraine had the maintenance contract for them through to 2014. They also made tanks for Russia or Soviet Union. There's a very big tank factory in Kharkiv, which has got huge piles of rusting relics of the ancient Soviet Union tanks, because they used to make them. And they made all sorts of things and the Ukraine, of course, was a significant part of. They were involved in making nuclear weapons, for Russia as well. That's part of the reason why they had so many nukes, and they gave them back to Russia. So why did Russia invade Ukraine, which is so capable militarily, when it could have invaded the Baltic states, which between them, they're not in the military defense hub, never were. Between the three of them, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, they don't have a single fighter jet of their own. They never have. They have never had a single infantry fighting vehicle or tank. And why didn't Russia invade those countries? There would have been a huge advantage for Russia. So you have Kaliningrad, which is cut off from Belarus by Lithuania, and it's got the Baltic states around it. If Russia could take the Baltic states, they could join Kaliningrad to am I using the right word there? Yes. the Russian enclave on the Baltic Sea, sanctioned between NATO members Poland and Lithuania. Yes, so Kaliningrad. So that's the city that it would be a huge advantage to. So I guess I'm just somewhat improvised that. I should have. Anyway, so the Russians it would make a lot of sense for the Russians to take over the Baltic states, and they could probably have taken them over in a few days. So why didn't they do that? Because they're in NATO, so they couldn't actually take them over. If they were on their own, if there's nobody, if they weren't in NATO, Russia could have taken them over in a few days probably. But because they're in NATO, it couldn't, so it didn't even try. So that's the point of what I was saying there. And at the end of the Ukraine war, when it stops, then the Ukraine said that it will be safe with just the Russians, the Ukrainian soldiers, that they have at present about 800,000 Ukrainian soldiers. And then if their allies will give them an upgrade of the equipment they have to the level of what the allies already have, which is vastly superior to what Ukraine has, then they say that will be sufficient, along with a token force of naval patrols in the sea, because Ukraine doesn't have a navy, just a kind of symbolic thing to show to Russia, look, don't attack our ships. The Ukrainians can already sink the Russian ships, but as a symbolic thing. And then also the air power flying in air patrols over the western part of Ukraine. So these kind of symbolic things just to show that they're behind them. The actual fighting, if Russia was to start again, would be against the Ukrainians. And Ukrainians are confident that if they just have a somewhat upgrade of their equipment and better air defences as well, that Russia can't invade again. So that's a very reduced size mini NATO, far less capable than the rest of NATO, and Russia won't be able to attack that. So there's no way that Russia's going to attack NATO. They can do grey area things just to be a nuisance, and the drone attacks, they were not a preparation for anything. The supposed the drones flying over Copenhagen, they weren't really attacking, they were just buzzing with bright lights on, and the end result of that was to stimulate NATO countries to improve their defense against drones. And so they're now using Ukrainian technology, and they're going to defend the entire, by the end of 2027, they'll have a drone wall, a metaphorical drone wall, along the entire border with Russia. And that was the result of Russia buzzing Copenhagen with whoever it was that they buzzed with their drones, their bright flashing drones. So that was hardly a brilliant strategy to try and, it's obviously not them really attacking, just being a nuisance. So there's no way that Russia is going to attack NATO. And I've got these pictures I've talked about before. Admiral Ladakin puts it most clearly about how he says that the question we should ask is how quickly could NATO take over the air and the sea in any area of combat where there's combat between Russia and NATO. He doesn't give the answer, but from open source, less than a day. Probably much less. In any theatre where they were engaged with each other. So there's no way that Russia is going to attack NATO. And then, as for China, it hasn't attacked anywhere in any military action this century, except fisticuffs in the Himalayas, and I think there was one gunshot. That was illegal because it's in a demilitarized zone. And knife fight in the Philippines with Philippine sailors in the Spratly Islands. And that's the extent, that's the entirety of Chinese experience, combat experience this century. So China's got all these amazing modern technology, fighter jets and the air defences, which didn't work very well in Iran. They didn't protect the Ayatollah. The Ayatollah was protected by the best Chinese air defences. yet it didn't seem to make any difference. I mean, possibly the Iranians weren't using them very well, and the details would be secret, top secret, but the United States has learned a little bit about their air defences by fighting them in this war. China's has got no combat experience with any of its equipment, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. It looks very good on paper. They seem to be much more careful than the Russians in designing it, but it's never been tested, except to a certain extent in Pakistan, where Pakistan's missiles shot down Chinese jets with Indian jets with Chinese interceptors that had a longer range and were more precise than the Indians were expecting. So the Chinese do have this equipment. It probably works, and almost certainly if they're ever involved in combat, some of it won't work, because that's just the way of it. When you enter into combat, you've got all these things that work very well in exercises, and some of them don't work. So China has got no combat experience and has never attacked anywhere this century. Nothing since basically 1970s, I think, 80s. Not sure. I have to look it up. I think it's a minor engagement a bit later, but nothing with modern equipment anyway. That's the main thing. So, and China is not allies with Russia or North Korea. They don't share intelligence with each other. They don't share technology with each other. The Chinese. So when there was all this video on TV about the Putin and Kim Jong-un and the president of China all together at this Xi Jinping all together in with these big display of Chinese equipment. Well, neither North Korea or Russia has any access to that equipment. The Chinese is not going to share it with them. And the same way, Russia is not going to share its equipment with China. So you're talking about a very different kind of relationship than there's between NATO countries, where everything is freely shared, and you've got intelligence sharing as well, and it's very much, and it's an actual, of course, a defensive alliance, and there's no alliance between these countries. So none of these countries are allies with each other. They are all in Eurasian continent, but they're not allies of each other. We're not in a world war. There's nowhere that can even become a world war. We're not at an edge of a world of one. It is just local conflicts. And if you look at the fraction of the population, then it's just a couple of percent. If you have Iran plus the Ukrainians, and it's of course not the entire area of Ukraine, and then there's another fraction of a percent for local wars in Africa and a few other places. And almost virtually all of the world population, far more than 90% of the world population, is currently at peace right now. And then if you look at NATO, so this fills our news, but it's a tiny fraction of the world population, and the rest of the world at peace, it doesn't get on our news, because being at peace is not newsworthy. So you get a very biased idea of the world. It seems like the entire world is at war, because you see wars constantly on TV. The reality is, pretty much the entire world is at peace, because you don't get peace on TV, because it's not newsworthy. So it's important to realise this very, very biased view of the world that we get. And if you look at TV programmes and what's shared on social media, and just to underline this, for those of you in a NATO country, there's never been any interstate fighting on NATO territory since it formed. Falklands, for the Falkland War, it's an overseas territory of the United Kingdom, but it's not part of NATO, so that doesn't count. No other country has ever attacked a NATO country. No NATO country has ever attacked another NATO country. There was a conflict between Turkey and Greece in Cyprus, but not between the two countries themselves. And you have, more recently, there was Italy and France on opposite sides in Libya, sponsoring the conflict on opposite sides in India, in Libya, and of course they're not attacking each other in NATO. That's another example of being on opposite sides. Does not mean that you're fighting each other. Those are two examples of that. So if it's localized to a particular conflict area, they weren't fighting on each other's territory. So NATO has been at peace since it started. Both nobody else dares attack them, no matter where the members are fighting in the world. So NATO country members have been involved in wars all over the world, but nobody has ever attacked NATO. And no NATO countries have ever attacked each other as interstate fighting. I'm leaving out things like the troubles in Northern Ireland, which is internal troubles. So this Iran war, it's a very small war as wars go, and Iran is less and less able to fire out of Iran, while the United States and Israel, they have unlimited capabilities because they're using very low-cost glide bombs, and they can produce tens of thousands of those a year. So they could keep on dropping bombs on Iran indefinitely. That would not make it a world war, that would just make it a war with lots of bombs falling in Iran. And there's very little that Iran can do fighting out. And so it will stop when the United States decides to stop. That depends on pressure from its allies, from Arab states in the region, from Russia, from China. That's diplomatic pressure from Russia and China, not military, of course. And virtually the entire world except Israel want the United States to stop. All these European allies want it to stop. Then internally in the United States, it's got pressure from Congress, it's got falling levels of approval from the United States people, and then it's got the effects of gasoline prices on the public. And then I wrote this before the whole sea mines thing, so I've got a separate video about that, and about how the pressure of the price of gasoline seems very likely. It's led to the release of the oil reserves, the strategic oil reserves, to keep the prices down, because of the sea mines that Iran seems to have sowed a dozen sea mines in the Hormuz Strait, and so Trump may just have to stop this war because of that. And as I explained in the first half of this video, when the United States stops, then Iran will stop too, because it's the aggressor, just like when China invaded Vietnam, and when China stopped attacking Vietnam, the war was over. And it's a very similar situation. If the United States and Israel stop attacking Iran, the war is over. And not very long after. So, and then there's a very long process of going back to getting them somehow back to the negotiating table, to this deal that was in place. It was such a very wonderful deal that was almost there. I mean, I was just so hopeful before this strike happened. It was just such a wonderful deal. And then it was extraordinary achievement by Trump, indeed. He does have a good reputation as a deal maker. He keeps keeping up to his reputation, except in the middle of the deal, he suddenly, I'm sure he would never do that in a business deal, suddenly drop a bomb on the other side when he's in the middle of, he couldn't do that when he's in the middle of agreeing to a wonderful deal to buy a new skyscraper or something, but that's essentially what he did with Iran. And so he's got to now get back to the negotiating table somehow. So anyway, hope that helps, and helps you be less scared of this thing. And any questions, be sure to say, and check the video description. For if you are on YouTube, then I'll put a link to this blog post in the video description.